The socialist calculation debate is a debate that has been raging in economics since the Bolsheviks came to power in Russia in the second decade of the 20th century. In my view, it is one of the stupidest debates in the field, and that's saying something given how silly many debates in economics are. It started with an essay written by liberal Austrian economist philosopher Ludwig von Mises, and was further expanded by the replies of another Austrian economist philosopher and comrade of Mises, Friedrich von Hayek, the so-called market socialists in Britain. Mises and Hayek were centrist liberals. That is, their ideal political order was one in which technocratic policy is used by a constitutional democratic state to ensure that all individuals have access to what are basically the same rights, obligations, and opportunities. In particular, they fell on the right-wing spectrum of modern technocratic politics, given their conviction that the only way to ensure a proper constitutional democracy is a market economy based on legal private property rights. They thereby scorned socialism and fascism as two sides of the same totalitarian coin, given that socialism insisted on the abolition of private property and often the replacement of the market with rational planning by collectives of producers, and fascism demanded that all economic activity be subordinated to the aims of the national community, effectively abolishing the private commercial economy of capitalism. They were also, along with their American colleague and superstar neoliberal economist Milton Friedman, the most important critics of the New Deal's social democratic political economy of the immediate post-World War II period. In particular, its deployment of Keynesian state spending and corporatism, a class compromise enforced by institutions of state power designed to represent different social classes, with Hayek in particular arguing that the Keynesian consensus was putting the West on the road to socialist/fascist totalitarianism, and thus the loss of the political dimension of its Enlightenment liberal tradition. Mises' argument in his initial pamphlet, Economic Calculation of the Socialist Commonwealth, kicks off the socialist calculation debate with a bang. He argues that the replacement of market prices as mechanisms for the allocation of resources, either by state or community planning of the process, would lead to disastrous results in terms of the misallocation of said resources. Basic idea is that prices perform the function of signaling information to producers. Firm A is able to calculate costs of production because prices act as units of accounting, ultimately based on similar calculations on the basis of prices done by Firm B, which sells Firm A inputs into the production process. Firm A is further able to use prices in its industry to determine relative demand for its wares, and thus sets the prices of its goods and or services according to information communicated by other prices in their respective market. If prices in the system of markets and private property they are based on are abolished and replaced by the directives of the community or state planners, then the mechanism which performs this function of conveying information to producers will be distorted, or worse, will no longer exist. Planners will be left in the dark about the availability of resources and demand for products, and thus have no way of rationally deciding how to allocate resources. General calamity thus ensues, as planners will be unable to do much more than make educated guesses about how best to allocate resources. Hayek extends this argument further, calling it the knowledge problem, into an argument against administrative centralization and for decentralized nodes of decision-making. Hayek emphasizes that central planners will necessarily be removed from local conditions and will thus lack practical knowledge about those conditions relevant to overall planning calculations. By contrast, the price mechanism automatically communicates information about local conditions to all different nodes of the overall resource allocation process by allowing specific producers to set prices as they see fit. Market prices thus swamp central directives in the capacity of information that they can integrate efficiently into the decision-making process, meaning that replacing market prices with central directive is an ultimately disastrous and irrational move. Hayek was extending Mises' argument in reply to the so-called market socialists in Britain. These thinkers, such as Oscar Lange and Abel Lerner, were in fact not socialists. They were not interested in the creation of a society based on the free association of labor, but were interested in the utilization of the scientifically rational state to guarantee a minimum standard of living for all. They thus fit in with the moderate left-wing centrist technocratic liberalism in the post-war period, which sought to use the bureaucratic mechanisms of the state to design scientifically rational policies which managed the economy in a way that guaranteed everyone the same basic structure of obligations and opportunities. In fact, it has been emphasized that the British market socialists agreed with Hayek about the need for a limited political order based on the rights of the individual, but embraced a kind of command economy related to the politics of the British Labour Party as the best way to ensure such a political order on the economic front. While Communist Party dictatorships during the Cold War maintained command economies, this was only supposed to be a transitional political economic form. All genuine socialists, as opposed to moderate left technocrats, going back to Marx and Engels themselves, understood socialism to be a social order based exclusively on the voluntary association of those involved in productive activity. Thus, even for the arch-totalitarian Joseph Stalin, the ultimate vision of communist society was one in which the state had withered away, and productive abundance had made possible the free distribution of social wealth according to the needs of human individuals. As such, the communist movement was divided between a statist Marxist orthodoxy, which believed in the transitional capture of state power, which would wither away upon the completion of the class struggle, and anarchist communists, such as the ever-influential Pierre Kropotkin, who advocated the immediate destruction of the state in favor of a bottom-up federation of voluntarily formed communes. As such, both Mises and later partisans of the calculation argument made the effort to ensure that it applied just as well to decentralized economic planning and a genuine socialist mode of production as to the planning characteristic of technocratic command economies. American economist Murray N. Rothbard used the arguments of the Austrian economists to argue not for technocratic moderate right-wing liberalism, but for libertarianism, the political ideology which demands the complete solitary sovereignty of the individual over all social arrangements. Rothbard was such an extreme libertarian that he advocated the complete privatization of all state functions so that there could be no monopoly of legitimate use of violence, and that said use of violence would be a competitive market between private security firms. He called this anarcho-capitalism. Conscious of the fact that anarchism was a pre-existing political ideology which was socialist in character, Rothbard published an attack on their ideas entitled The Deathwish of the Anarcho-Communists. In this piece, he made the familiar libertarian arguments against socialism as conceived by anarchists, namely that policing individual sovereignty in order to ensure the eradication of Marxist and private property required the creation of a totalitarian political order, rather than a stateless society. In addition to these arguments, he also deployed Mises' calculation problem against anarchist communism with a Kropotkin type. He highlighted how Mises' observations showed that replacing market mechanisms with planning on the part of producers' communes would eradicate the price mechanism and thereby leave the communes without any means of communicating or obtaining information pertaining to supply and demand. Thus, anarchist communism would be no less economically calamitous than state socialism. More recently, partisans of the Mutualist version of socialism, advocated by pre-communist and anti-communist anarchists such as Pierre Proudhon and Benjamin Tucker, have used the calculation problem as a defense of their preferred version of socialism against communism. Mostly concentrated under the banner of left-wing market anarchism within the Center for a Stateless Society think tank, they have revived probably the only real version of market socialism to ever exist. According to what Proudhon called mutualism, worker cooperatives and independent producers would come together in voluntary federations to create and manage financial institutions which ensured that all market exchange was conducted according to just principles of non-exploitation and non-domination. In writing for C4SS, William Gillis has used assumptions about the incommunicability of relevant information from the ECP literature to make the economic calculation point against anarchist communists. Philosopher of science Carl Polanyi put forward the thesis that the scientific method consists in a number of incommunicable skills scientists have mastered. Just as bikers, runners, and swimmers have developed skill sets through experience that they can't transmit to others merely by giving methodological lectures, scientists have developed their own set of scientific skills by experience that aren't reducible to any set of explicit theses or methodological instructions. Mutatis mutandis, according to partisans of the calculation problem, the same applies to producers who have developed skills in price setting for their business based on practical experience. As such, Gillis points out that producers all have their own set of independent skills, experiences, and preferences, which won't be possible to communicate through mass assemblies in a commune. Further, it thereby would become easy for the most articulate and charismatic actor within a commune to claim to speak for the needs and knowledge of all and amass undue decision-making power over the planning process, thereby leading to an imbalance of power which, while informal, is not aligned with anarchist principles. Price mechanisms, however, communicate information in non-verbal ways, like experimental data collected by a scientist. In this way, price mechanisms can communicate various forms of skill and resource allocation, and along with them, incommunicable aspects of the preferences of economic actors, without having to assemble everyone into a mass meeting and somehow communicate this incommunicable information. Interestingly, despite furnishing them with an argument that market relations are a transhistorical necessity, mainstream economists were dismissive of Mises and Hayek's arguments in view of the Keynesian assumptions of mainstream political economy after World War II and before the neoliberal turn in the 70s to 80s. The industrial dynamism of the Soviet Union seemed to furnish empirical evidence of the erroneous nature of the claim that price mechanisms were required for efficient allocation of resources. After all, although, as ECP proponents point out, Western assumptions about Soviet industry overestimated its efficiency on account of lack of quality information, it is true that the Soviet Union and other communist command economies displayed an uncanny ability to carry out industrial and military expansion comparable to that achieved in the West Industrial Revolution in a fraction of the time. With the neoliberal turn and collapse of the Soviet Union, the calculation argument became something of a mainstay in mainstream economics, despite the fact that it is dominated by neoclassical theories of equilibrium explicitly rejected by Hayek. Further, it became woven into post-Cold War historical scholarship on the political economy of existing socialism. It was assumed that economic disasters such as famines in Stalin's Soviet Empire and Mao's People's Republic, as well as economic stagnation in the late period of communist rule, for instance in the Khrushchev and Brezhnev eras of the USSR, was the result of centralized state planning distorting price signals by failing to allow for private profit and loss mechanisms in resource allocation. The scholarship, which was no longer interested in fighting the ideological battles of the Cold War, married itself to an argument that the failures of existing socialism were due to the trans-historical superiority of capitalist relations of production. That this is the result of political economic fads rather than strong political economic arguments is clear from the fact that none of the scholars who make these arguments go back to tell us exactly why the necessity of price signals and private profit and loss mechanisms didn't seem to matter in the first few decades of communist rule and expansion in the way that it did at the point of communist collapse. Clearly, the calculation problem applies to any proposed technologically advanced alternative to capitalism, so its use by left-wing market anarchists advocating mutualist socialism doesn't make much ultimate sense. Clearly, from the point of view of Mises and Hayek, the social regulation of market exchange by social federations would count as a distortion of price mechanisms, since such a federation, even if it allowed market exchange to exist, would have to tightly regulate that exchange to ensure that structures of class domination do not arise. So the Mutualist Federation would take on numerous resource allocation functions, which would thereby be excluded from regulation by the price mechanism. The function of the calculation argument has thereby always been to argue that a capitalist economy is a trans-historical necessity, since it is the only social system which puts all social wealth under the direction of the price mechanism by transforming it into a mass of commodities to be bought and sold. The argument has, since Mises first made it in the second decade of the 20th century, consisted in opponents articulating the argument as a positive case for the impossibility of an alternative to capitalism, various advocates of economic planning offering rejoinders of various kinds, and then proponents inevitably responding with the reasons why the latest rejoinder from the advocates of planning doesn't address the problem. Mises himself responded to the proposal of Vienna Circle Marxist Otto Neurath that economic calculation could be done on the basis of actual availability of resources, called calculation in kind, arguing that it couldn't work given that there was no way in the absence of money to measure qualitatively different forms of goods and services against each other in terms of demand and efficiency. We have already encountered Hayek's rejoinder to the British market socialists. Cockshott and Cottrell's New Socialism is one of various proposals for making state planning viable in light of the calculation debate through the use of large-scale computation technology, which has only become a real possibility in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. New Socialism, again, isn't really socialism, as its premise is not the free association of labor, but the technocratic administration of social production to maximize social utility, a view one might call radical technocracy, which can be found without reference to information technology in the so-called utopian socialists criticized by Marx and Engels. In particular, New Socialism repurposes the labor theory of value, which for Marx and the classical political economists was a theory of how capitalist societies work, into an administrative framework where computers calculate efficient allocation of resources according to labor time. In response to this and other IT proposals for solving the calculation problem, Austrian economists, in the tradition of Hayek and Mises, responded by using Hayek's point about the incommunicability of consumer preferences, local contexts, and price-setting skills. If these factors can't be communicated, then they can't be inputs into a computer calculation. Thus, IT-style solutions to economic calculation don't work. What is silly about this endless debate, besides the fact that most of the so-called socialist proposals have nothing to do with actual socialism, is that none of the parties seem to realize that the argument for Mises and Hayek has always been fallacious. In particular, the argument is a non sequitur. It doesn't follow. It is true that in capitalist society, prices are essential mechanisms for communicating information about supply and demand to producers. This observation, however, does not get us to the necessity for price mechanisms in communicating information in all modes of production. The reason that prices are crucial for economic calculation in a capitalist society is that the capitalist mode of production has to coordinate the separate activities of individual producers buying and selling. Prices are thus the natural mechanism for coordinating supply and demand between separate enterprises, each pursuing their return on their own investment. Indeed, if social planning from the state or other institution interferes with the normal operation of price mechanisms, then economic disaster is bound to follow. That said, Hayek in particular idealizes price mechanisms far too much. They are not decentralized mechanisms of social decision-making, which reveal preferences perfectly without interference from centralized power structures and their arbitrary designs. As explained by economic historian Emanuel Wallerstein, prices are based on semi- or partial monopolies. In order to charge a price, a producer needs to have some effective and exclusive control over an industry, or else competition could simply bid down prices to zero. As such, political mechanisms such as copyright, war, and espionage are used to establish this sort of exclusive control until competition from other producers eventually breaks it down. As such, bottlenecks and inefficiencies related to distortions of economic mechanisms by centralized political power come along with the very existence of the price mechanism. Idealizations aside, prices are indeed required for coordination of production within capitalism, but again, this does not tell us that they are required for any coordination of production within any social system, capitalist or not. Let's consider a genuine socialist society in which production is administered according to the needs of voluntarily associated producers. The way that calculations about the availability of and demand for resources are made in such a society is via the diffuse judgments of various producers entering and exiting voluntary and mutually beneficial social arrangements. These arrangements coordinate production and distribution from the bottom up as more and more producers become involved and voluntary negotiations become more complex. Social wealth in such a society does not take the form of a mass of commodities to be bought and sold, but is directly consumed and accumulated in order to satisfy the needs of all individuals. In such a society, what function can the proponent of the ECP claim for price mechanisms? Agreements between producers would be arranged according to mutual benefit, and thus the preferences of individuals at every node of economic activity would be prioritized in any aggregation of productive activity at the large scale. Indeed, these instances of what Kropotkin called free contract and mutual aid could not communicate supply and demand information within a market. This, however, is not their purpose. Their purpose is to directly produce items of social use which satisfy the needs of individuals in consumption. Without the commodification of social wealth, prices are not needed to communicate information about resources and preferences because resources are not commodities. They are not produced for the private gain of separate actors in the market. Rather, they are produced to satisfy the conditions of mutually beneficial arrangements crafted around the needs of social individuals. The only relevant information in such a society for administration decisions pertaining to social production and distribution are the needs of individuals and the available resources. Whereas in a capitalist society, the marketability of the product of production takes precedence even over these considerations, and this information can only be communicated via prices. One could try to press the calculation point by deploying Hayekian/Polanyian considerations about the incommunicability of preferences and skills, but it's not as if non-commodity producing societies have no way of acting on the basis of incommunicable skills and preferences. Mutual aid and free contract would empower individual producers to make decisions in collaboration with others based on these preferences and skills without having to communicate them to others and without a central planning board having to monopolize this knowledge. Again, Hayek merely assumes that since prices are set on the basis of such incommunicable information in capitalist society, that the only way to factor this information into production and distribution is through price mechanisms. The upshot is that socialists need not have a solution to the calculation problem. It is not a problem in need of a solution. It is a fallacious argument. Socialists need only point out the fallacy.